Thank you so much, guys, for joining today's Lunch and Learn session, and welcome to EAQA. Today's topic is about the Selenium box, but before we get into the topic, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the speaker and the company he works for, and of course about the product itself. Today's speaker is very special to us, in fact, and he is the co-founder and the CEO of Element34, and he is Michael Palotas. Prior to Element34, Michael was the head of quality engineering at eBay, and he has served there for more than 10 years, and he has helped the company in shaping up the software and the test engineering. And Michael was the person who's behind the design, development, and open sourcing of the Selenium Grid, Selendroid, and iOS driver as well. Before joining eBay, Michael was playing leadership roles in companies like Ericsson, Nortel, and Intel as well. So a little bit about Element34. It is a company that is a leading provider for on-prem Selenium Grid infrastructure. And the company is specialized in the Selenium ecosystem completely. And the company's founders are key contributors to Selenium and developed the open source Selenium Grid, in fact. Element34 was founded in 2015, and it has been privately owned and has offices in Switzerland and in the UK as well. So about the Selenium box, it is, of course, Michael is going to take us through the Selenium box demo as well. And but prior to that, Selenium box is an enterprise level Selenium Grid that runs on-prem. Yes, it is completely managed and highly scalable within the corporate firewall itself. It has nothing to do with the cloud. So testers or the organizations need not worry about sending the data to the cloud or an external infrastructure. So everything is within the organization's firewall. So I think with this said, I will hand it over to Michael to get started with the session. I think, Michael, it's over to you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Giri, for the nice introduction, and welcome everybody also to the EAQA meetup. It's actually funny because the team that I was running at eBay for 10 years was called EUQE. So when I first saw EU Quality Engineering, so when I first saw the EAQA, then I'm like, okay, this sounds very, very familiar. Good. So thanks for having us here at the meetup, at the Lunch and Learn. And yes, so today is going to be about Selenium Grid. Giri mentioned a little bit, of course, we are playing in this space. We are a company that provides a product in this space. However, I do not want to make the next 45 minutes or so about our product. I want to, show you what a Selenium Grid is, talk a little bit about why we need one, and then show you the options of what's out there, right? And there's, of course, there's choice. There's not just our solution. Our solution is one of the solutions, but there are also other solutions. And what I really want to get across in this session is give you a little bit of a guidance through your thought process, and to give you a bit, just basically give you a bit of guidance in terms of if you're at the point where when you're thinking about Selenium infrastructure, what are the things that you should think about, right? And then whatever the best solution is for you, that's not for me to decide, that's for you to decide. Good. So I will share my screen. Giri, can you just let me share my screen? I'm apparently not allowed to do so.
Oh, okay. I think, Rian, can you just enable?
All right,
yeah, thank you.
Try it now.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, can you see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Good. So as Giri already mentioned, we are Element34 Solutions, and the overall topic of this webinar is running cross-browser and mobile tests at scale in your enterprise, yeah, and everything that that comes with that. So Element34 Solutions, we are headquartered just a little bit outside of Zurich in Switzerland. And what we do is we're completely specialized in providing test automation infrastructure to companies, right? That's what we do. So we are not a consulting company, we're not a training company, although we do both of that as well. But our main focus in terms of what we do is test automation infrastructure. And we're also key contributors to Selenium and Appium. We most notably created Selenium Grid. So everybody who's been working in the Selenium space already and has come across the open source grid, that's actually coming from us. And when I say us, of course, not just myself, but mainly actually from our CTO, who is also a co-founder of Element34. And the gentleman is called François Renaud, and he's the main person behind Selenium Grid. Good. So what do we want to do today? So we want to first talk about Selenium Grid, what it is, and why we need it and when we need it, right? Maybe not everybody who is in the session needs it yet, but I'm sure if you're working in the Selenium space, you will come across at some point the question, well, and where do I run all this stuff, right? And so that's what we're going to address in that agenda topic. Then this is the main topic. What are the options for a Selenium Grid? How do I just go to the store and buy one, or how do I get a Selenium Grid into my world? Then we want to talk a little bit about the difference between, if you're a small startup company and you're looking at a Selenium Grid, or if you're working in a larger company like a bank or an insurance or anything bigger, what kind of different requirements may those enterprises have when it comes to test automation infrastructure? And this actually is not just related to Selenium alone. Is actually you can apply that pretty much to any kind of testing infrastructure that may be out there. Then, of course, because typically this question comes up, people say, yeah, but I read this blog post about there's this kind of solution and there's maybe another solution, and they're all open source, they're free, etc. So, what's the deal with these open source solutions? And just to shed some light on that, in terms of, also, especially when we look at it from an enterprise perspective, is that something that you should be looking at, or what are the potential pitfalls with just taking something off GitHub and playing with that, right? Then we'll do a quick demo, so just to put a visual to all of the stuff that I'm talking about. So I'll do a real quick demo of our product, and then we'll do a quick summary and a Q&A. Yeah, so that's the plan. We have about 45 minutes from now, so I think my presentation should take about 25 minutes, half an hour or so, and then we have tons of space and time to discuss and address questions. Okay, so first of all, what is a Selenium Grid and why do we need it? So when we look at or test automation in general, right? There's always the left side of this slide where I'm assuming most of you are going to be located, right? Which is most of us are involved in writing tests, in creating the test cases, executing them, and all that. So that's what we call the test authoring side. Yeah, and there you can, when you talk about Selenium, you can write your tests in Java, you can write your tests in C#, in many different languages. You can, of course, also use commercial tools like Ranorex, like Tricentis, like Eggplant, Scriptworks, that provide a layer on top of the raw Selenium API, and may make it easier to author tests, right? It depends on your requirements, what you want to do. But that's all on the left side. So that's not us. So we don't do that. That's somebody else who does that. On the right side over on the screen, we see the applications under test. So ultimately the stuff that you want to test, yeah? And those could be your development environments. Those could be a local build on your laptop. That could be a pre-prod, a staging environment, anything like that. So any application that you want to test. So what we do is that blue box in the middle, and that's the Selenium Grid. And that's the place where you execute all those tests that you write over on the left side. So you may have dozens or hundreds or thousands of tests, right? And in order to run those, you can either run them, of course, locally on your machine, which really doesn't scale very well and has a big limitation on browsers and operating system versions and things like that. So you want some kind of infrastructure component where you can just say, here are my tests, and I need all these browsers, I need all these different mobiles. But I don't want to really worry about how I'm getting them, and if there's a new browser release or anything like that, right? So that's the piece that we provide. So or that we provide as a company, but of course also that's the part where Selenium Grid comes in, right? So that's the Selenium Grid that we are looking at in the middle here, yeah. Good. So the question is, what are the different options out there? So if you say, just to go back, if you say, all right, so I know what I want to do on the left side. I know that I'm going to write my tests in Java, or that I'm going to use one of these tools. And now if you come to the point where you have enough tests where you say, all right, it may be worth it to actually look into some kind of more professional infrastructure where I can execute these tests. And so now the question is, do you go to the store and just buy one, or what are the different options for that blue box in the middle? So option number one would be to build this yourself. And, we already heard, so there is Selenium Grid, or Selenium, the project is of course open source, everything is open source there. Including the Selenium Grid component, that's also open source, right? So you can just go out, download it, install it, and then build on that. So this is what we call homegrown open source based, which of course, has some implications, positives and negatives, right? We're gonna look into that in the next chapter, but this is just one of the solutions. Then the other solution that's out there is to say, well, actually, I don't want to build this. I just want to buy it, right? And there's many companies out there who provide a SaaS service, a software as a service product. And, so we're going to get to that later as well. But this is basically where you just buy a product. This is in the cloud. This is a cloud product typically, right? And you just buy it, you tell them how much of it you want, and then you pay accordingly to that. And then the third solution, this is what we call on-premises or on-prem and managed, right? And this is the rather unknown component, or the rather unknown option, where you have basically what you would have with a SaaS solution, except that you have it running on-prem or inside your firewall. And this is the space where we're playing, right? But as mentioned, we're also, of course, going to look at the other two and just kind of compare the different options and the different pros and cons that you have with each of the solutions. Yeah. So to our knowledge, with all the market research and everything that we've done, these are the three main categories. And now what we can do is we can look at each one of them, right? And so let's start out with homegrown and open source based. And typically when you're at the beginning of your journey, right, if you don't yet have all the CI pipelines set up and you don't have thousands of tests, this is probably what everybody's kind of looking at and say, well, okay, I need a Selenium Grid. Let's build one.
And you can absolutely do that because it's super easy to get started with that, right? So you just download the necessary components and off you go. And typically what we see is, in order to get some little demo Selenium Grid up and running, I mean, it could be a matter of minutes, right? But I would say realistically in a larger company, you probably after a few days, you have something that you can demo, right? So it's very easy to get started with. There's no upfront cost, because it is open source. You don't have to raise a purchase order or convince your manager to, pull out his credit card and pay for something. It's all free. Of course, it does require what we call internal engineering resources, right? I mean, if you spend 2 days of your time on investigating the open source Selenium Grid, that's time that you spend on that and that you don't spend necessarily on something else, right? And as you go along, so as you add more and more capabilities to this internal Selenium Grid, and as you scale it up and and add more functionality, of course, those internal engineering resources, you will need more and more and more of it. So what we've seen, and don't nail me down on these numbers, but what we've seen from our customer base, because a lot of our customers actually, they started out just like that, right? And if they keep it that way, they typically spend between 250,000 up to 2 million per year on human power on this, right? This is not just the servers, and of course, which you also need, but this is really just the human effort that it costs a company to run a Selenium Grid at an enterprise level, right? This is, of course, out of that demo stage, but if you want to provide this for your, if you're a big bank and you want to provide this to all of your software engineering teams, you end up with a team of a few people, right? And that's, I mean, you know yourself, that nobody works for free typically. So, it ranges anywhere in between those numbers. Now, even if you're willing, as a company, if you're willing to put that money on the table as an investment, there's also what we see typically no service level agreements if something doesn't work, right? So it's not like you can call somebody and say, actually, it's down, can you please fix it? It's usually a best effort support system. Of course, depends a little bit on how you're organized in the company, but that's typically what we see. And also one of the key things, and the reason I know this is because I was heavily involved into building the open source grid. The majority of the enterprise features that you require in a large company are actually missing, right? Which means that you either live without them or you have to build them yourself. And of course, you have to build them and then you have to maintain them, yeah? And also the open source grid was never really built for scale or performance. It was, back in the eBay days, we built it for our internal use. And then what we open sourced is something that was more in a demo state, right? This was never meant to, power a large organization. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you think about building building and maintaining an open source Selenium Grid. I always say, you can always get people excited about building something like this, right? It's if you're interested in it, it's a nice job, right? It's something interesting. It has different components that you look into. It's not just Selenium, of course. There's also a lot of system administration, DevOps type of capabilities that are required. But once you've built it, the boring part is the maintenance. Right? And then nobody gets excited about maintenance. And that's what you absolutely need for a Selenium Grid. Because when we look at, what's in that blue box, it's browsers, right? For example, browsers and mobiles, right? And stuff changes there all the time. There's new browsers, new Selenium versions, new drivers all the time that are being released. So if you don't maintain your homegrown grid, it's going to be out of sync very, very quickly. And which means that you will probably get somewhat questionable test results because some stuff works, some stuff doesn't work, right? And that's the death of most automation projects, when the results, when you can't trust your automated tests, right? So that's something that, you know, that we see in the homegrown open source based space. Again, try it, right? But probably think about when, you know, at what point you get to that level where you're like, you know, this doesn't feel right anymore. I actually need, you know, 10 people to maintain this when I have 2 people that are writing the tests, right? So that's no longer in balance. Good, but something you can try. The second option is SaaS. You know, you decide, no, I actually don't want to build all of this. I want to buy it, right? And I want to have as little as possible to do with any of those browsers and the infrastructure that I need, right? And that's basically SaaS. So they are fantastic solutions, right? They have very rich features that you could only dream of in the open source solution, right? Also, one important part for some organizations is you don't have to deal with infrastructure, right? With the homegrown solution, of course, it's running on your servers, you know, so you are also responsible for that, right? And whereas with SaaS solutions, you don't have that. They run all the infrastructure and everything. There's zero maintenance when new browsers or practically anything changes in the ecosystem. It's the SaaS provider who takes care of that. Yeah. And one thing that, of course, you really have to think about is SaaS solutions, they are outside of your network, right? So if you're a bank, you have your bank network and then you have a SaaS solution. And the browser that tests your application sits outside of your network, of your infrastructure. And this is something that you really need to think about, because there are potentially, you know, security and data privacy issues, right? So you are, whatever test data you use, that data is sent outside to that SaaS solution and can be read without any problem on the other end. Of course, the transfer is encrypted, but once it comes out of the pipe on the other end and hits the browser, everybody can see it, you know, if somebody wants to have a look. So that's something that you really have to look at, right? You, of course, also share infrastructure with other customers in most cases, right? So you just buy a certain capacity from the SaaS solutions, and but it doesn't mean that, you know, the other bank doesn't run their tests on exactly the same infrastructure, right? So you're kind of relying on how the SaaS providers clean up after themselves or clean up after the tests, things like that. So not only do you send data outside, right? But of course also that browser that sits on the outside requires to have access into the infrastructure of your enterprise, yeah? And which, you know, again, may or may not be a problem. It's just something that you have to think about before you sign the $5 million deal with one of these solutions. That you know, that's, you know, you have to go through security clearances, that they fully understand, okay, what type of data is sent out and what type of access do you actually need into the network. And so you need these tunnels, which, you know, in some cases can be somewhat tricky to operate. Depends a little bit on the implementation, of course. And the last point here is the performance aspect. And again, you know, this cannot be generalized. This really depends, of course, on your network, and mainly how far away or what type of network there is in between your network and the SaaS solutions network, right? Of course, if you're sitting in London and you're using a SaaS provider that sits in, I don't know, in California somewhere, you have a long ways to go for every single Selenium request or WebDriver request that goes across the wire, right? And so this is not because the SaaS solutions are slow, it's just that the nature of the internet, that you have to get from point A to point B, and and there's latencies involved, and therefore, you know, your tests may or may not be slower. So again, this is something you should definitely try out before you buy. Yeah. And so to name just a couple of names in that space, most, you know, I'm sure you know about most of them. So there's BrowserStack, there's Sauce Labs, there's other solutions. There's lots of different ones, you know, but I think overall their offering is very similar, right? They provide this box with browsers and mobiles. Good, so that's the SaaS space. And the last one that we have is the on-prem managed space. And this is what I mentioned. This is, if we think about it, we take what you get in the SaaS space with all those fantastic features that they provide and bring that inside your network, right? So you kind of get both of the best of both worlds, right? So this is something that runs inside your firewall, inside your corporate network. Of course, this is something that requires infrastructure on your side, right? So this typically runs in your data center somewhere along with all the other applications, but it's something that you need to provide. But in return, you get a maximum level of security because nothing goes out. So you don't send anything outside, which also has a nice effect that you don't really have to think about, can I use my production-like test data to test my applications with? I mean, we all know what it's like. You know, in some cases, it's just inevitable that you're using pretty production-like data, or, you know, even production data, and put it onto your test systems, right? And that's something that you are usually not allowed to just send across the wire, right? It's done in many cases, of course, but, you know, that doesn't mean that it's actually legal or that your CIO can't get into major trouble over that, right? So with an on-prem managed solution, you don't have all that headache because everything runs inside. It's, of course, highly scalable. Again, you know, also mainly because of because you're in full control over how much server power you give to the solution, right? So if you need to double your capacity, in many cases you don't even need to ask the vendor. You just add more processing power to the system, and, you know, so it's fully under your control. Also, because it's running inside the company's network, the integration points are a lot more native, right? You don't have to expose anything. You don't have to open up anything. If you want to integrate with your LDAP server or your LDAP API, you can do that because you're already inside the network. From a speed perspective, and, you know, again, you know, I'm sure there's exceptions to this, but just simply because it's running inside the network, it's by nature going to be most likely faster than if you go outside, right? So the performance increase, sometimes we see a 5 to 10x performance increase when we bring the Selenium Grid inside your network. And the same thing would apply, of course, if you build it yourself, right? So this is not because one solution is better than the other. It's just simply because one is running inside your network and the other one is running outside of your network. Yeah. One of the important things here, of course, is you also get a fully managed solution, right? So if anything changes, there's a new browser, there's new drivers. You as a user, this is completely transparent to you. So all the heavy lifting is done by the vendors, right? And so you can fully concentrate on writing your tests. Yeah. Good, and of course, because it's a commercial product, or these are commercial products, you get SLAs around it. You get, you know, 24/7 support or whatever you want to have in your contract. Good, and one of the solutions in this space would be our solution, which is called Selenium Box. Good, so I think, you know, this hopefully shed some light onto the different, you know, the different paths you can take. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's different in an enterprise compared to, you know, if you're maybe a smaller company, or if you're a company that, you know, doesn't handle any personalized data or anything like that. You know, if you're I don't know, maybe, you know, a company that has ads or something like that, where you don't have health data or banking data or anything like that, right? But typically there's three main aspects that we see that apply specifically in an enterprise. And first and foremost, it's security, right? So if you're a bank, if you're an insurance, if you're, you know, in the medical field, you simply cannot afford that anything happens with your data, right? So if you test with production data or production-like data, and it gets out and somebody says, oh, Michael has $37 million in the bank, I don't, but it would be nice to have, right? Then that's a problem, yeah? Or Michael's been to the doctor 3 times last week, that's also a problem. That's something that, you know, is nobody else's concern, yeah? So security, and then the scale, right? Even though you start small, when you're a big enterprise, it will grow very, very quickly, right? It's not like you just typically scale linearly. You typically, you know, once you ramp up, things become very, very big very quickly, right? And that's something that you have to account for in an enterprise. And then last but not least, the enterprise features, you know, such as, again, LDAP integration, just general integration into the rest of your enterprise workflows, yeah? So those are the three main aspects. And, you know, if we break that down, when we talk about security, that just bottom line, it means that usually in enterprises, sensitive data cannot leave the corporate network. I mean, it can, but it's not allowed to, right? From a legal perspective, you're not allowed to send anybody's data to somebody else, yeah? And of course, also external access is difficult or not even allowed. And so one thing here that I just want to throw out, I attended an online conference last week, and it was hosted by one of these SaaS providers out there. And one of the things that actually the SaaS providers said was, and I just put that in there, you know, as a replacement for pretty much probably every SaaS provider that is out there. So they actually said that we are watching a lot of what is happening in your tests, right? So which, bottom line, it means that a SaaS provider, if they want to, they can see absolutely everything that you test. They know how many tests pass, how many tests fail. They know how, you know, what kind of data you use. They know everything about your organization. And that, of course, is something that some organizations may be okay with. And for others, it's a total no-go, right? So this is just something that I wanted to put out there. When we talk about scale, what we're typically seeing is that we're not talking about dozens of tests that run concurrently, we're talking about hundreds of tests that run concurrently. So even if you build your Selenium Grid today and it's able to run 5 or 10, think about the, you know, what would that mean if I had to run 100 or 500 tests concurrently? Would I be able to handle that with my architecture, with my infrastructure behind it? Yeah. And then last but not least, you know, enterprise features, I already mentioned LDAP, or just mainly access controls to allow people to do certain things or not to do certain things, to see certain things and not to see other things, right? All that fine-grained control that you have or that you want to have, this is something that, you know, that is typically a requirement when you're talking about Selenium Grid in a large, in an enterprise. Good. So this is what you know, what we specifically see stressed when we talk to customers or potential customers. They are usually looking at these 3 main topics: security, scale, and enterprise features and integrations. Good. So no worries. you know, you don't need to read every single line here. But also because we typically get asked, so, okay, so, you know, can you show us a side-by-side comparison of some of the solutions that are out there? And I'm not claiming that this is a complete, that there are no other solutions out there, that we've captured absolutely every single feature. But what we've tried to do is we tried to group what's out there in the SaaS space. So that's on the right side. And we just took Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, and Perfecto as an example. And then on the left side, we have the on-prem solutions with our solution. We also have Moon, Selenoid in there, Docker Selenium, just the Dockerized grid, and then Selenium, which I'm going to have a specific word about just in a few minutes. Yeah. So I think, you know, when you look at it, if you're at this waypoint where you say, all right, I need a Selenium grid, so which route do I go? Then if you look at a chart like this, if you say it has to be on-prem, right? Everything has to remain inside my corporate firewall, then that automatically rules out this entire right column here, right? And not because those are bad solutions, it's just that if you have that requirement that nothing can go out, nothing can come in, and you know, and you rather keep things to yourself, then SaaS will be a difficult conversation, right? And then you have to look on the left side what options are out there, yeah. And then the main differentiators here between the different options is really, you know, what kind of browsers are supported. A lot, you know, Docker, Selenium, or also Selenoid, those solutions mainly support Chrome and Firefox on Linux, which is great. But when we talk about an enterprise, you need typically Windows-based browsers, right? So you may need IE, you may need Edge. You actually may need Chrome and Firefox on Windows and not just on Linux, right? So again, you know, if Chrome and Firefox on Linux is sufficient, great, right? If it's not, then you need to see what kind of options there are out there. Where it becomes even more complex is in the mobile space, right? So do you have a requirement that you run on emulators only, or do you also need to run on real devices, right? And depending on that may lead you to one or another solution, yeah? So again, just as a high level overview here, right, what's out there, I'm assuming these slides will be probably distributed later, so we can, you can have a closer look at that. All right, and so just before I close or before I show you the demo, just a word about open source solutions. And so open source solutions in general are great, right? There's lots of them out there. They are, they evolve very quickly, but make sure when you pick one, and this doesn't just apply to a Selenium Grid, this applies to, any open source solution that is out there. Make sure that they're actually actively maintained, right? Go on GitHub, look in the commit history, and if you see that there's been no activity in the last 2 years, then either it's a very mature product, which could be, right? I mean, there's stuff out there that is done, right? That does what it's supposed to do. But, typically software needs some maintenance. And if there hasn't been any activity on it for the last, for a longer time, chances are that the project is maybe dead, right? And so that's probably not a horse that you should bet on. Also, another thing is check the number of maintainers. A lot of these open source projects, they're one-person shows, yeah? So, and I'm gonna show you one of those examples later on, yeah? So if you see that 99% of the commits are coming from one person, that could be an indicator for this being a one-person project, and then you should ask yourself, well, what happens if that one person moves on, right? Doesn't want to do it anymore, or maybe gets told by their new employer that you're not allowed to work on that product anymore, because maybe it competes with what you're actually working on in the commercial space, yeah? And last but not least, do you get the features that you need? right? Just because you can spin up something for a hello world scenario, it doesn't mean that you actually get all the features that you need. And check what actually gets sent back to the open source projects. A lot of these open source projects are based on, on the fact that when you run a test, they actually log back to the open source project maintainers. They have an overview of who runs it, how many tests get run, and things like that. And just as a very recent example, and this took a lot of the Selenium infrastructure people by surprise. So Selenium was a wonderful open source Dockerized Selenium grid. If you go onto GitHub, right, it had 200 GitHub stars, which means it's very popular, right? So again, really nice product. Maybe not for everybody, but it did a lot of things very well. And sometime in March, I believe, this actually showed up from one day to the other, right? It said this project is not being developed anymore, and there you are, right? So we know a lot of companies that are stuck now where they have this project deeply ingrained in their stack, and now it's no longer maintained, right? So now they either need to maintain it on their own, which they didn't want in the first place, or they need to find another solution, right? So I think this, again, it just shows that do some due diligence when you pick, also when you pick a commercial solution, of course, right? But specifically because it's so easy to try out open source solutions, it's a big step from just trying something out to actually having it in your enterprise toolchain. Okay, so with that, we're gonna go to the demo, just to give you a visual of all the things that I've talked about, right? And so what I prepared is, there we go. So this is Selenium Box from a user perspective. And if you are maybe used to products like Sauce Labs or Browser Stack, this is not, those products don't look dramatically different, right? The main point here is that when you run a test, you should be able to see something, right? You should be able to take videos, watch the videos, maybe kick off a manual test or something like that, right? So here I basically have this this user interface. I'm logged in as myself, and I'm not running any tests at the moment. Yeah, and now I'm just going to go here into my IntelliJ, and I'm just going to run a very simple test that goes to ScriptWorks. It's just going to fill in their contact form. Right, we have a couple of thread sleeps in there, no need to get nervous, just to slow things down, right? So I'm going to run this. And this is going to be now sent to our Selenium Box instance, and here we go. So here it already shows up, right? So it shows me as part of a project, shows me on which browser I'm running, and of course I can also go in and actually watch the test run live. So this is happening in real time on the Selenium Box on Chrome 81, yeah? So that's that. I have the event stream. I can, of course, also stop the test or hit a breakpoint at any time and just, and debug the test and watching everything running live, yeah? So this is also something that, for example, with an open source grid, you don't have that, right? You would have to build this functionality to see something, right? With SaaS solutions, this is standard, right? And of course, also with any kind of commercial on-prem solution. Now, just to add a little bit more scale to it, if we say, well, we actually want to run that test not just on one browser, but on multiple browsers, you can do the same thing. I'm just going to kick off the test. And then instead of just one browser or one test, I should see multiple ones here. There you are. So we have the 2 Chromes already, the 2 Firefoxes, right? And then we can actually see all 4 tests running at the same time concurrently, but on different browsers, right? Because maybe it is a requirement for you not just to test on the latest browser, but also on some older browsers. Yeah. You can go in and for the test where you created a video, you can go in and actually take a video or watch a video of your tests, right? So you can take those videos, put them somewhere else into your final repository or whatever you want to do with that. Yeah. Another one of those enterprise features would be the ability to start a test manually, right? So if you say, well, not only do I want to run through Selenium, but you can also say, well, I just want to fire up the latest Chrome, right? And so here you get the latest Chrome, right? And then we can go to meetup.com, right? So I can remote control the browser with my mouse. I can go in. I can debug everything directly, right? So I can open a Chrome, like a developer console, etc. Yeah, I can take videos of this, of course, and things like that. Yeah. So again, just that you get a little bit of a taste of what we're talking about here. So as you can see, this is not the part that we do. This is the part that you do. You write the tests, and we provide that execution infrastructure in order to run those tests. Yeah. Good. So just to go back here as a summary before we open up the Q&A. So what I wanted to get across was we have three main approaches for Selenium Grid: homegrown, SaaS, or managed on-prem. Before you do anything else, right, decide if it's an option to go outside to a SaaS provider or if your data needs to remain inside your firewall. And this is typically not a decision that is taken by developers or test engineers. This is a very high-level decision that usually goes quite high up, sometimes even to the CIO of a company, right? Because you as an individual contributor may not have the entire picture of what kind of data you use. You may just get a database filled with data and you're like, cool, I can test with this, right? But what's actually in there and how that actually relates to real people and to real, cases and things like that, that's, maybe you don't have the visibility. So definitely raise this, right? Because if you don't and you do actually go outside when you're not supposed to, it could have very, very severe effects on your company. And when you look at open source projects, do your due diligence just have a look who's behind it, how many people are behind it, and when has it been active for the last time. And last but not least, think about the scale, right? So even though everybody starts small, most of these enterprise grids become quite large in a short time frame, right? So if you decide to build yourself, make sure you have the support for it in your back. Good, and that's it from my side. So I think we should have a few more minutes for questions and answer. So I'll open up that.
Well, thank you, Michael. So we haven't got a Q&A feature as such on this. So if anyone does have questions, then please just start talking, and hopefully people won't talk over each other.
Okay, probably I'll just shoot up the first question, Michael. So the first question is from the mobile testing perspective. So it says that we can run our test cases with the real devices as well, isn't it? So when it comes to the local infrastructure, in the sense where we are installing the Selenium box, so how is this real devices being handled?
So if you decide that you want real devices, what we provide is basically a rack that's, you know, that has space for devices, and you're in full control of that as well. So you decide which devices go in there, how many times you switch them, how many you want to use concurrently, right? So it's not like, because I mean, that, I think that's actually a very good question, because a lot of these mobile, you know, these homegrown mobile apps, you end up with dozens and dozens of mobile devices that are just floating around in the office. What you get as part of our solution, you get basically the whole rack. That's where you have one place where everything goes in, right? And that's the main controller for all mobile related stuff.
Ah, wonderful. Thank you.
How are new browser versions and things like that handled? So again, is that up to the customer to update their own browsers, or is that something that's handled by Selenium Box?
No. So, I mean, if we talk about Selenium Box, so that's done by us. So we, whenever there's a new browser that releases, we do all the testing. And then when we deem that the browser is in good shape and, you know, cooperates with everything around it, then we release it. And then basically the Selenium Box installations just pull those binaries. We never push anything. They just pull the binary into the installation, make it available, and that's it, right? So this is a completely transparent process to the customer, right? So that it just means that, you know, they come in the next day and then they have the latest browser available. Exactly the same as you have with the SaaS solutions. They do exactly the same thing, right? Of course, if you're building it yourself, the grid, then you have to take care of that as well. Yeah.
Cool. Cool. Probably my last question, Michael. So how is it feasible with the CI/CD? Like running from Jenkins or something like that?
Let me just go back to the... Oops, here we go. Yeah, so if you look at this slide, so your Jenkins or Bamboo or your CI tool would be over here on the left side, right? So Jenkins issues the same W3C compliant HTTP request as my Java binding would, right? So in the end, any tool that is able to, you know, talk Selenium in the end can be on that left side, right? So there's actually, you don't even need plugins or anything like that. It's just, you just say, you know, Maven test or something like that, and it will just automatically send everything over.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So is it, so I don't have to give any special configurations in my Jenkins as such, isn't it, Michael?
No, you just say, where do you want to run it, right? So if we look in the code here, right? So this is the magic line here, where I say it should, you know, it should run there. And whether I run that from my IntelliJ or whether I run that from my Jenkins, it's always going to end up in the same space. Yeah.
Good. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Any other questions from anyone?
Hey, I have a question. So coming to the, like suppose we have a enterprise organization, we need some 50+ devices. So who will maintain those devices? Like who will purchase the devices? So,
sorry, I didn't catch that. You were fading in and out. So who would purchase the devices? Is that the question, or?
yeah, correct. Like you said, like the rack with the multiple devices.
Yeah.
Yeah. So who will take the responsibility? Like suppose if I want an iPhone with different versions, like with a mobile version.
So there's different ways you can do it, right? You can either say you take care of all of that, right? And then we basically provide you with the rack, and you go and procure the devices if that's what you want. Or of course you can also purchase them through us, right? And then we can also then do the replacement, right? If you want to switch out the different devices and things like that. So that's more of a license type of or a conversation that if you say either you take care of that or we take care of that, right? That's how you want it. And of course, when we talk about real mobile devices, I mean, that's the top of the of the pyramid in the end. When we talk about browsers and when we talk about mobile emulators, there is zero maintenance in terms of of having to do anything when something changes. Of course, if you want to switch out your mobile device for another one, somebody has to go in and do that, right? So, and that can be either you or that can be somebody from us, right? That's usually how it works.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from anyone? Okay, I'll just take it as no for now. Thank you so much, Michael, for giving us this such wonderful session about the Selenium box. I hope it was useful for many of us who joined this particular session. And we will definitely make sure that this is going to the YouTube and we can share it in our social networking to reach more people. And Rian, do you have anything to tell?
Sorry?
Wonderful. No problem.
No.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining today's Lunch and Learn session. I hope it was useful, and we can get in touch next week about another interesting topic. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.